Okay, this one's on what's more logical, Socionics or MBTI? This is the question of the ages. And the title is Socionics, Bias, and the Tale of Two Polar Functions. And we have a profound quote here, and that is that the inferior is so close to the unconscious and remains so barbaric and inferior and undeveloped that it is naturally the weak spot in consciousness. And that's from Marie von Franz from Lectures on Jung's Typology. Basically, the subject of this one is that Socionics is supposed to be the more logical typology system as opposed to Myers-Briggs. I always say that it is the goth version of Myers-Briggs. And I think that Socionics is useful for some things, and it's also pretty interesting to me. And anybody else that's listening to this at this point, you probably are interested in Socionics. But one of the big issues is the authors usually don't agree with each other a lot of the time, and then sometimes a single source doesn't even agree with itself. I also saw an interview with C.G. Jung where he was talking about the personality types, and he said you really shouldn't get too schematic about his personality types and thinking about them. And you just keep that in mind because today we're looking at a socionic source that describes the 16 types and their strong points and their weak points, and we're basically going to catch it contradicting itself. So we're going to catch the source contradicting itself. Now, basically the claim is that Socionics is a well-polished machine, and in being internally consistent between within each model, then you can have intertype relations that map each of the 16 types and every one of the functions. So you have 8 functions, and they're mapped between types. So if you know two people's types, you can predict how they might relate to each other. And when you read it next to the Myers-Briggs, some of it makes sense. So there's some things that you get with Socionics that you're not going to get with the Myers-Briggs. But the thing is, there aren't really statistics or any peer-reviewed studies to go with it. Like, there are some journal articles that you'll get for Socionics, but it's basically just within, like, you'll have one school of Socionics, like people from, I guess, that work in one building, and they're kind of just each looking at each other's stuff. There's no, like, peer review with, like, the rest of psychology around the world. So that's really problematic. And, I mean, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It implies that it's wrong, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. So basically, it has to rely on being really internally consistent and airtight. Because if the whole thing's supposed to be, like I said, a well-polished machine, then you happen upon something that doesn't make any sense. It's hard to take the rest of it seriously. And just the test case here that we're looking at is this Prokofieva and Kuzmina type profiles from the Wikisocion. And basically the pattern from this page is that for every type they talk about the strengths, but then they say that there's a serious deficiency with this type, which is listed as the polar function or the vulnerable function. So we're gonna look into a little bit of that. And basically the short version here means that no data means that the logic is the whole product of Socionics, so the logic better hold. So we got a control case. So the control case, where the source is doing what it's supposed to do, or whatever you're reading from the Wikisocion is doing what it's supposed to do. So you can take ILI and SLI, that's INTJ and ISTJ, and both of them have extroverted feeling as their polar function. So the ethics of emotions, or how they express themselves emotionally, is a problem. So they have trouble manifesting emotions. And then in the quote, it says, ILI's main drawback is the painful inability to adequately demonstrate his emotions. And there's another one. Similarly to the ILI, the SLI experiences difficulties in expressing his feelings and emotions. So basically it's the same polar function with the same verdict. So you have the ILI and the INTJ and the SLI, ISTJ, same thing. It's very similar. And the text even says similarly to the ILI. And pretty much across most of the 16 profiles, the polar is listed as the deficiency. Now, the contradiction is when you get to the EII and LII. So the INFP and INTP. So both of these types have what Socionics calls volitional sensing. It's extroverted sensing. Socionics just always uses this term, volitional sensing. I think it's because this stuff is translated from Russian. So I've almost never heard anybody, a native English speaker, use the term volitional. It's certainly not volitional sensing. Like nobody would say that if it weren't for these machine translations. So anyway, the INFP description pretty much the deficiency is listed as extroverted sensing. So it's explicitly said that one of the INFP shortcomings is deficiency of volitional sensing, which shows itself as an irreconcilable attitude towards violence and use of force. And then you have forceful pressure from the outside has a suppressing, destructive effect on the vulnerable INFP who is unable to resist such pressuring for a long time. So this basically kind of paints the INFP or EII as somebody who can't resist pressure and can't back their moral principles with force, and they're an idealist who can't put their money where their mouth is. It's just strange because in this same text, you have the LII or INTP who has the same polar function, and somehow it's not the deficiency. They actually list ethics of relations, which in Socionics, I believe that's FI. So that's FI in Socionics. And so for INTP, that's the listed deficiency. So that's the role function for INTP, not the polar. And it's literally from the same page. So, you get that somehow it's not a deficiency. And it's like the INTPs, this is what they write in this page. It says, INTPs are also sometimes viewed as stubborn and hard to persuade. And then in parentheses, it says, the function of volitional sensing is hypertrophied. I don't know what that means. Well, I kind of know what it means. It'd be hard for me to explain it off the top of my head. Like I said, TI is a shadow function for me. But it basically means like it's grown out of proportion. But for whatever reason, it's like, why is that different for the LII as opposed to EII when for INFP and INTP, that should be similar, just like the ISTJ and INTJ should be similar. So, in other words, it's like the same function that pretty much cripples INFP is overgrown in the INTP, who is seen as being firm like a rock in matters of principle. They literally write this, that INTP is firm like a rock in matters of principle. And for whatever reason, the INTP's official deficiency gets moved to the FI, which is the role function. It's strange. Okay, so just the short version. Too long, didn't read. The INFP's official weakness turns into the INTP's strength with the same function in the same slot. It's very weird. Why? I think why this happens, the short version is this pretty much Socionics' blind spot is pretty much where the author's blind spot is. So the originator of Socionics is ENTP. So FI is their blind spot. And because it's made by somebody who is ENTP, that's FI is going to be treated in a weird way. So, I basically think that in general, Socionics is largely an alpha quadra NT social system. And like I said, the founder, Osra, is ILE or ENTP. And then INTP, which is LII, is the other alpha quadra NT. And the people who are most likely to be writing these descriptions and talking about Socionics online in a positive light skew pretty much the same way. People might say, oh, well, there's people of other types that also are going to write Socionics descriptions. But the ones that people take more seriously or put more weight into are probably alpha quadra NT. Like Victor Gulenko and Osra, for example. They're INTP and ENTP. So there's a little bit of favoritism. And the pretty much flattery that's going to land on the writer's own quadra. And basically, the deficiency framing lands elsewhere, and that elsewhere is in FI land, basically. And it's just like you have all these loaded terms, like INFP in typology in general kind of is like a loaded term, and you just see it in Socionics too. Like, for example, let's say somebody is calling someone a nice guy, it's like it's a loaded term. It's a loaded FE term. It's like, okay, that's a person who thinks that they're nice, but they're not. But in other terms, it could be that you're basically just saying somebody is unattractive or unpopular, or so they're not like socially smooth, and then that gets them called a nice guy. So if you're looking at that in FE terms, it's basically like an FE landmine, because even if you try to defend that or talk about it in other ways, then basically you kind of get lumped in with it too. So, but if you look at it very seriously, then it quietly assumes that the socially skilled or attractive people, or whatever, the ones that aren't being considered nice guys, are the honest ones. So this has tried defending the term. You can't. Like, it's a landmine. You can't defend it. So INFP pretty much falls under that too, I feel like. And also, this is because the INFPs are conflict averse and don't play TI and FE dirty social tricks. Basically, they don't really play verbal social tricks. So it's basically the target doesn't hit back because they're SE polar, but they also don't play. They're also not good at playing dirty social tricks, or just, it doesn't have to be dirty, just verbal social tricks in general. So the framing kind of sticks. So there's another thing too. It's like, you might say that the standard defense, or the standard defense is probably to say that this is generally what a gamma NT would say, or the TE types, or yada, yada, yada. But, I think that most people that are scientifically inclined would say that they would want claims to be tested. It's like, why wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be cool if the claims were tested and they came out to be true? But you really don't need Socionics to tell you that. Like, you don't need Socionics to tell you that anybody scientifically inclined would say the same thing. And I think it just happens to be that other types just aren't interested in fringe psychoanalytic typologies. So you just don't hear it from them. Like, there's the gamma NTs are the people that are probably more likely to be interested in this kind of thing, but then also be like, hey, is any of this been tested? Like, yeah, that sounds nice, but is it tested? And then also, it sounds like there's some issues with it. So could we test that and see if it's real? Other people, like, I feel like ISTJs and ESTJs just aren't aware of Socionics, because they're not going to go out of their way to find something that hasn't been tested at all. Even if it shows some promise, it'd be hard to persuade them that it does have promise, unless their benefactor or supervisor did try to. Anyway, so that's neither here nor there. It's basically, I think that there's a little bit of bias here. And here's a quote. It says that INFP's sacrificial attitude may be aimed at people who have no need in it. And it's like there's really like condescension even in talking about the positive qualities of this type. Is that a sacrificial attitude and just the FINE in general, and being sincere, but not being ready to take up an extroverted sensing challenge because you have SE polar. I feel like it's cast in like a very strange light that doesn't fall onto INTPs that also have extroverted sensing polar. And I feel like you see that a little bit you see that a lot in Socionics. You don't see that so much in the Myers-Briggs, but still, I feel like INFP gets a bad rap. So some takeaways. Socionics is supposed to be less biased and more logically consistent than the Myers-Briggs, but you can see clear bias that's baked into its own canonical distribution. Sorry, not distributions, descriptions, canonical descriptions. And the cleanest example is that the same polar function gets different verdicts depending on whether the type sits in the author's own quadra. And they just, for example, here, the INFP's volitional sensing SE is a deficiency, whereas the INTP's is hypertrophied or hypertrophied. And because there's no stats or peer-reviewed studies that are backing any of this up, then the airtight internal logic was pretty much all we had to go on. But there's contradictions. So the Socionics is pretty much failing at its own standard. And I still think at the end of the day that Socionics is still worth reading and is really cool. And I think that there's some real things that it's noticing and that it describes that other systems, other typologies don't even bother trying to describe. And I feel like you just have to read it knowing that some of the viewpoints and descriptions are pretty much written from biased perspectives. And you have to remember what Jung himself said about his own personality types, and that's where Socionics comes from. And he said pretty much like, don't get too schematic about it. And it's like, if the guy who invented it was saying that, then it's probably a good cause, because then you end up with stuff like this. And I think that's it for this one, and I'll see you guys in the next one.